Chapter 1. Karolena should have considered how much she hated getting her hands dirty before she'd accepted a job as a glorified maid for an entire building full of dangerous men and women, especially since her new coworkers reminded her so much of the bad people she was running from. Except, even in the 24 hours she'd been employed by S.H.I.E.L.D. security services, she could see its staff members weren't precisely the same as her evil ex. Or maybe she simply wanted to believe she hadn't landed herself in worse trouble than the sort she'd so recently, hopefully, escaped. She prayed again that she'd spent enough time around liars and thieves to have faked her background check well enough to pass the scrutiny of her new bosses. Karolena wrenched the cap off a fresh bottle of cleaner, breaking yet another nail in the process. Of course. As she dumped the hyperblue liquid into the bucket at her feet, each glug of chemicals did nothing to cheer her mood up. Her mop plopped into the mixture with enough force to slosh a fountain of now sudsy water onto the slate tiles of the kitchen floor she was attempting to make shine. If only she'd ever done routine housework before, she might have better technique. Was getting it so wet going to mess up the grout or wreck the finish? She had no clue. Karolena groaned. She couldn't afford to lose this job. As shitty as the work was, the opportunity had met every requirement of her desperate plan. It paid better than anything else she'd seen, given she had exactly zero skills or qualifications. It also came with room and board, even benefits, plus a bonus she hadn't even hoped for: built-in security. Because although the Shields didn't realize she was on the run, they sure as hell weren't about to let random strangers wander into their headquarters. Especially not when they and their loved ones, including the founder, Jordan's pregnant wife, lived there too. Karolena had lucked into the perfect haven, and she couldn't fuck it up now. Wow, that's really foaming up. Karolena jolted. How was Tavish so quiet in those black leather boots that paired so nicely with his kilt? She'd assumed the security guard, or whatever his actual title was, had been dressed up for the Shield's party the night before. If instead he planned on flashing those sexy legs covered in amber fur all the time, she was going to have to build an immunity to him, his cut muscles, and his easygoing appeal. His Scottish accent agitated her because it piqued her interest. It also reassured her, given that her Russian heritage colored her own speech more than she'd like, even when she'd concentrated on stifling all hints of her foreign roots. No one here seemed to judge her for how she spoke, or where she came from. For a company outside of a major metropolis, they seemed pretty accepting of people from way, way out of town. Of course, they wouldn't be so nice if they knew who she really was and what she'd been a part of, unwitting or not. Karolena forced herself to concentrate on the giant mess she was making before she gave herself more to clean. She swallowed hard. Even the astringent chemicals she'd probably used way too much of in the wash water couldn't completely obscure the scent of Tavish's soap, or the cologne, or whatever that spicy vanilla smell was that she was quickly beginning to associate with him. He leaned in for a closer look, his slightly longer than shoulder-length hair tumbling forward over his collarbones. Tavish scooped the locks into one hand and pulled them into some messy, half-up, half-down, top-knot man-bun thing that she never would have expected to find attractive. Yet on him, it was. Is that supposed to do that? Tavish pointed at the foam expanding across his floor. The mat of bubbles thickened until it looked as if winter had come early. The apartment he shared with his partner, Legend, gave off upscale rustic vibes, grounded in comfort. Weathered wood, stone, and wrought iron details came together beautifully. It made her feel like she'd been safely ensconced in a bear den. Or maybe it was the size and dark scruff of Tavish's roommate that gave her that impression. Karolena shivered, even as she hoped she didn't ruin anything in their home. To distract herself, she took the mop and flailed around in the lather with it. That only made it expand faster, gobbling up her ankles and the mat in front of the sink. Tavish hopped back to spare his boots. Maybe this wasn't how it was supposed to go? How the hell would she know if the floor cleanser was working properly? Oh, right. She was supposed to be a professional. She hated to admit it, but seeing her nails already ragged and uneven, instead of perfectly manicured, didn't improve her mood. When had she become used to being pampered? Was that why it had taken her so long to break away from Vladimir, despite the way he'd treated her for years? Karolena attempted to disperse the ridiculous pile of suds, along with her dark thoughts, by smooshing them around with enough force that the mop handle creaked. Her frantic swipes only seemed to agitate the soap, increasing its volume instead of reducing it. Sort of like the feelings that kept bubbling up inside her now that she was, for the moment, safe. "Everything okay in here?" Legend asked as he passed through the kitchen, hopping from the edge of her multiplying disaster, then over it entirely, like an elegant and considerate socked gazelle, instead of the grizzly he resembled. "It's fine." She intended to talk to Tavish, Legend, and the rest of the shields as little as possible. If they would go away, she could get the situation under control without their watchful stares on her every movement. These men and the rest of their friends were capable and insightful. She would be foolish to forget it. Not only because of the predatory movements they made, or the way their eyes stalked her as she worked near them. Not only because of the gun safes she'd spotted tucked neatly into each of their closets when she was wrestling with the vacuum earlier. Not only because she'd explicitly and repeatedly been warned that the basement was strictly off limits. Not only because they might figure out where she'd come from and either kick her out or send her back, but also because they could so easily make her care, something she'd sworn never to do again. James, with his quirky fashion, tact, and conversational interview style, had thawed the first corner of her heart. Kennedy, who'd reviewed their medical benefits, including mental health services, and asked if there was anything Karolena needed right away, had cracked her resolve to be cold and aloof. The endless parade of laughing, ridiculously happy lovers Tavish had introduced her to the night before made her wish for a fairy tale ending of her own. It was a temptation she had to resist. While avoiding Tavish and Legend's curious stares, Karolena glanced at the photograph magneted to the side of the refrigerator she was swiping around in an attempt to spread out the mountain of bubbles. Of Tavish, in a more formal kilt. Craggy mountains pierced a bright blue sky in front of a still, deep lake. Boulders tumbled around the edges were blanketed in green and yellow moss. It made a dramatic backdrop for the bridal party he had been a part of. Off to the side of the groom, who looked too much like him to be anything other than a brother, or maybe a cousin, Tavish cheered as the happy couple kissed. Did moments like that happen in real life? At least for some people? Something so ordinary and beautiful and traditional seemed far more improbable to her than the life she'd lived, which would probably seem out of reach to most. Sure, it had been filled with luxury and glitz, endless wealth, and a ruthless pursuit of more, but it hadn't meant anything to her. None of it had been real, and all of it had come at the expense of so many innocents. Karolena shuddered. She hadn't been a willing participant in the crimes that had funded her crystalline prison, but she had seen plenty and been helpless to stop it for long enough that it would haunt her for the rest of her life. Especially if she managed to break free when so many others hadn't been so lucky. "Hey, don't freak out." Tavish must have misunderstood the cause of her deep introspection. "This is no problem. Let me help you." "No, thank you. I've got it under control." Karolena didn't even believe her own lie. Frantically, she resumed trying to snuff out the ever-expanding white blob, now engulfing half the kitchen. "Or I will. Just give me a minute, please." She took a deep breath through chattering teeth, memories still assaulting her. Cold? Legend asked, proving he hadn't wandered far from his partner or the intruder in their private space. He obviously hadn't missed her visceral reaction to her memories either. She was going to have to rely more heavily on the masking skills she'd developed during her time with Vladimir. I can set the AC to something more reasonable. I turned it down earlier so you wouldn't get sweaty while working. I hate when that happens to me. You're hot even when you're doing nothing. Tavish's breath hitched, causing Karolena's stare to wing between the two men now bookending her. Was there something between the partners beyond their professional bond? And why did being in such close proximity to them, alone, do anything but freak her out like it should? Especially since Tavish had been less than subtle with his come-ons from the moment he'd held the front door open for her before her interview, and then been assigned to show her around once she'd accepted the position and moved in right next door the night before. When Tavish swallowed hard and flicked an imaginary piece of lint from the hem of his kilt, she shook her head and returned to dispersing as many of the suds as she could. The temperature's fine. I mean, good. It's great. That was thoughtful, thank you. Why the hell was everyone being so nice to her? Vladimir wouldn't so much as notice the help, never mind change the thermostat to make them more comfortable. Karolena's gaze wandered one last time to the photograph on the refrigerator as she shoveled some foam onto the mop and attempted to drown it in the bucket. Tavish obviously had a family and friends he loved, and who loved him too. What was he doing here, on the other side of the world from them? If she'd had a choice, she never would have left hers. Her father, circumstances, and Vladimir had stolen that option from her years ago. Any warm feelings she'd been harboring evaporated in an instant. Anyone who could abandon their loved ones didn't deserve her lusting for them, and certainly didn't warrant a chink in her armor for their basic decent gestures. She would never allow herself to be blinded to someone's true nature so easily again. Lucky for Karolena, she wasn't a naive 16-year-old girl anymore. She'd seen enough shit in her decade of imprisonment, display, whatever she'd call her time with Vladimir, which was certainly not a marriage, despite their very public and elaborate ceremony. How much of this did you use? Legend wondered, reading the back of the bottle she'd set on the counter. The whole thing, obviously, she muttered as she glared at the empty vessel. She wasn't about to skimp. If they wanted her to clean, she was going to make the place gleam. Tavish cracked up, clutching his lean abdomen. All she could think of for a moment were the ripped abs he'd flashed when changing his shirt while she was dusting earlier. She blinked at him. It's concentrate, Karolena. Legend drew her attention back to his frowning face. The instructions say you only need a capful for every 3 gallons of water. Hadn't the sticker on the side of the bucket said it only held 2? Damn it. Sorry, I'm used to liters, not gallons. How pissed would he be if she'd ruined their kitchen? Vladimir wouldn't have hesitated to fire her. Or worse. I'll fix this, I promise. Legend only smiled kindly. James bought us each a set of extra absorbent microfiber towels we use to cover the gym equipment. I'll go grab ours and we can sop this up. Karolena shook her head. Just tell me where they are and I'll do it. It's my mistake. We'll feel less weird about having you clean our mess in the first place if you let us pitch in. Tavish argued. Legend nodded. The fizzle of the rising bubbles cut through the silence that stretched between them. But before she could agree, a knock at the door startled her. She spun around so fast she knocked over the mop, the handle falling through the cloud of bubbles and bouncing noisily on the tiles of the submerged flooring. Lost. That's okay. Tavish put his hand on her shoulder, even as Legend stepped so that he stood between her and the entrance. No one was getting to her without going through him first. Something uncurled inside Karolena that had been tightly wound since she darted into the night, alone and bleeding, on the outskirts of St. Petersburg, as Levin watched her flee. "There's nothing to be afraid of here," Tavish cooed to her, his brogue thicker as he did. Not unless it was them, and the kindness so many strangers had already shown her. "What are you three doing in there?" A woman sing-songed from the other side of the entry. "You know I can hack the pin pads on all these doors, right?" "Ruby," Legend growled. It was odd to see a man as big and solid as him roll his eyes, and yet his exasperation, reserved for their newcomer's little sister energy, somehow put Karolena at ease. Tavish grinned, then trudged through the bubbles to shove Legend's shoulder. "Let her in before she starts to think there's something a lot more fun than mopping going on in here. Unless you'd like to start moaning really loud and make her think we're as slick as she suspects." Karolena barely choked down the laugh that threatened to emerge from her tight throat. Shit. She hadn't even been here a full day, and already she was letting these people erode the barriers she'd erected to keep herself safe. She was officially fucked. Restraining the urge to swat Tavish or lob a ball of suds at him for teasing her in Legend, Karolena went back to corralling the disaster instead of trying to pry as their coworker entered. "Boys, we need you downstairs for a meeting." Ruby flashed a smile at Karolena before her eyes went wide. "What the hell?" "Nothing, it's not a big deal." Tavish blocked her view of Karolena's catastrophe. Grateful, she peeked up at him, and the red-haired woman wearing a graphic tee with a cartoon character across her chest. Ruby engaged in some sort of silent communication with Legend that irrationally irked Karolena. After a few moments, Ruby tossed her loose braid over her shoulder, then smiled. Unfortunately, it didn't seem entirely genuine. "Anyway, boys, let's go. This shouldn't take too long." "Must be important. Nothing good ever happens this early," Tavish grumbled. "Fine, we're coming." "Do you want me to leave and finish this when you're here to supervise?" Karolena gritted her teeth, but she would understand if they said yes. She was a stranger to them. They had no way of knowing they didn't have anything she coveted except for a way to earn her freedom. "Nah, do what you gotta do." Tavish waved his hands in front of his chest. "Probably best to get this under control sooner rather than later. Those towels we were talking about are in the hall closet at eye level. Sorry in advance for the state of Legend's bathroom when you make it that far." Legend smacked Tavish in the gut with the back of his hand. "Quit that." "Just kidding." Tavish winked at her. Despite her well-used bitch facade, Karolena felt herself cracking a bit of a smile at their antics, especially when Tavish strode toward her, then reached over, not too quickly, and wiped a daub of bubbles from her cheek with the pad of his thumb. The things his caress did to her should have terrified her more than Vladimir's brutality ever had. When was the last time she'd felt at home, at peace? These men and this place might be even more dangerous than she'd realized at first. Legend pointed to a spray bottle hanging on the cleaning cart James had supplied her with. "That one has the bleach. You'll want to use it, in moderation, for the bathroom, but not on anything like fabrics where the color could leach out." Right. Thanks." She winced. Damn sure she'd read the directions before putting it on anything. Before she could turn away, Tavish tucked a tendril of her platinum hair into the messy bun she'd wrangled it into, as if passing the gesture along from his roommate. The layers meant wisps kept escaping. It wasn't a practical cut, but then again, she'd never considered having to put it up during a shift of manual labor. This was her punishment. She'd lived a life of luxury at other people's expense, and now it was time to pay. "Knock on the conference room door if you need anything," Legend said. And then they were gone. Karolena took a deep breath, shook her head to clear it, then got to work dispersing the mountain of suds. It was easier to breathe and think straight without Tavish and Legend screwing with her mind and parts farther south.
You can listen to the rest of the book in the Tempt Romance Audiobooks app, available on the App Store and Google Play. The link to the book is in the description. Discover even more bestsellers and exclusive stories updated weekly, only in Tempt Romance Audiobooks.